Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 33rd installment of the PhenoTips Speaker Series. I'm your host, Dineen, and this is our annual Pride webinar. And if you can't tell already, I'm going to admit this is usually my favorite webinar of the year. So very, very excited to be here. And especially with the panel we have for y'all, you are in for a treat. So thank you everybody for joining. Today, as you can see, we're going to be talking about gender affirming cancer genetic counseling. And for those listening later, just know that PhenoTips Speaker Series is actually a live webinar. I am live right now. And so if you're listening to this as a podcast, make sure you check out and go to phenotips.com so you can check out when our next live webinar is so that you can chime in with questions and actually hear us while we're talking. But for those that, listen as a podcast, that's cool too. I'm a big fan of podcasts. So as I mentioned, we have an amazing panel. PhenoTips, really, we outdid ourselves, I think. Pat on the back to myself and Michael and Joel and everybody involved in the PhenoTips Speaker Series. Very, very excited about our panel that we have. And as I mentioned, we're going to be taking your questions more towards the end of the webinar. So I selfishly can focus on the questions that I have. But please don't wait until the end of the webinar to submit your questions because you might forget. So please submit them as you think of them if you are watching live, and that's going to be in the Zoom Q&A box. So definitely throw your questions in there. Maybe you have one right now, throw it in. For those that are not aware, we at PhenoTips have a complete EHR integrated solution for medical genetics. So we offer software and services that reflect the diversity of modern families and ease genetic professionals' workflow. We are very, very proud to support capturing sex separately from gender and appropriate pedigree symbols, among other tools for inclusivity, which is very apropos for today's webinar. PhenoTips Genomic Health Record includes these tools like the Inclusive Pedigree Builder, also has automated pedigrees, which make life so much easier as a genetic counselor, human phenotype ontology capture, built-in cancer risk assessment, also apropos for this webinar, and diagnostic insights, more like what do we not have, I'd say. And as we're all genetic professionals here, we have experienced the pain points that all electronic health records, I'm going to say it, all electronic health records are not built for genetics. PhenoTips is the only one that I've really encountered that has this genomic health record that fills in that gap that we all really, really need to provide a unified and seamless genetics workflow. So make sure to check us out at phenotips.com. And as I mentioned, my name is Dineen. My pronouns are she, her. I am your host for this webinar. I'm also the host of DNA Today, which is a genetics podcast I've been doing for almost 13 years. We've got over 340 episodes on there, won a few podcast awards, and we have genetic conversations just like we do here on the PhenoTips Speaker Series. And really excitingly, since we've had the last webinar series, I have launched a science podcast network called Gene Pool Media. And this show is actually part of the network and a lot of genetic shows, rare disease, anything really to do with science, but really mostly, genetics and rare disease. So definitely feel free to check out all the shows in the network, including this show. And I'm also a prenatal genetic counselor, which is not as relevant for this in terms of the prenatal aspect. More relevant is I'm in the queer community, hence my enthusiasm for this webinar. So enough about me and my voice. I want to have our amazing panel introduce themselves. We're hearing today from international cancer genetic counselors and LGBTQIA+ advocates and researchers. Again, I am blown away. I get to interview these people today. Kim, do you want to start us out introducing yourself?
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. My name is Kim Zahowski. I use she, her pronouns. So I'm located in Boston. I work at Boston University's genetic counseling program. Right now, I just work as an educator and a researcher, though I've worked as a cancer genetic counselor in the past. And most of my research focuses on the intersection between cancer care and genetic counseling for LGBTQIA individuals. And I focus more specifically on transgender and intersex healthcare, really trying to think about how we can do better by these communities. As a queer person, I just think about how our healthcare system has not been built for the queer community. And so thinking about how we can do better in genetics. So thanks again for having me.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time to join us, Kim. And Joe, returning to the PhenoTips Speaker Series, please reintroduce yourself for those that listen to all episodes and maybe for someone that didn't hear your previous installment.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me. My name's Jo Giblin. I go by Jo, and my pronouns are she, her. And I am a registered genetic counsellor in the UK. I'm based in Bristol at the moment. And I'm practicing in all areas of genetics at the moment, cancer, general, and prenatal. But where I sort of come into this is that in over the last few years, I've been working on making cancer genetic services in the UK more inclusive for our trans and gender diverse patients. And part of that has been sort of service evaluations and uh, a funded project to improve our services in the UK and developing first guidelines for the management of cancer genetics patients who are trans and gender diverse.
Yeah, amazing. I have definitely some questions for you as we get through in terms of your experience building that. And Diane, round us out. Please introduce yourself to the audience.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So, my name is Diane Kohler. I use she, her pronouns. I am a senior genetic counselor at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, also in Boston, just across town from where Kim's at. So, I've been involved in education, research, and advocacy focused on healthcare equity for trans and gender diverse patients for basically my whole career. I also was one of the co-founders and a former co-chair of the Gender Inclusive Subcommittee within the National Society of Genetic Counselors Cancer Special Interest Group. I'm also personally a member of the queer community, and I'm from a queer household, so I'm lucky enough to have two moms. So.
Amazing. I love that. I remember that from I actually interviewed you back when I worked for my Gene Council. So when I saw you on the panel, I was like, "Oh, this is amazing. I actually get to like talk to you instead
Blast
of
from the
email
past.
interview." Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, this is our amazing panel. And as we start out, I figured it might be helpful for us to define some terms that we've actually already started using here, because some people may not be as familiar with certain terms that we use within the LGBTQIA plus community, and especially just the, best way to refer to people and be inclusive. Kim, I figured I would toss it over to you to give us a little bit more context. Like we've already used the term transgender and gender diverse. If you could break that down a little bit more of who's included in that, and maybe some other ones off the top of your head.
Yeah, and first, I think it's important to probably differentiate sex and gender, just because I think that's really of utmost importance in this current sociopolitical climate. So, sex typically refers to people's physical characteristics. When we say words like male, female, intersex, those are related to sex. Sex is often assigned at birth, usually just based on people's genitalia, but other things that go into people's sex are things like chromosomes, hormones, genes on non-sex chromosomes and reproductive organs. Whereas gender refers to people's personal understanding of self, identities such as woman, man, boy, girl, non-binary, agender, and so on. So when we're talking about terms like transgender and cisgender, that refers to how people experience their gender. So transgender refers to someone whose sex assigned at birth is different than their gender. So a transgender man would be someone whose sex assigned at birth would be female and they are a man. Gender diverse is a larger umbrella term for trans folks, but also includes, non-binary folks, gender queer folks, and so on. Not all non-binary people consider themselves to be trans, though certainly some do. Whereas cisgender refers to people whose sex assigned at birth is the same as their gender identity. So a cisgender woman would be a woman who was assigned female at birth. And they're just, ways of being. Not one is not more natural or better than another. Again, it's just descriptors for how people live.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I feel like that we just need that clip and put it everywhere to educate people. Anything else that you wanted to throw in there, Diane or Joe, just in terms of setting the stage and just giving a little bit more of that background context?
I always find it helpful just when talking to colleagues about definitions that we have the we have this terminology in genetics already, don't we? We talk about variants being in cis or in trans. And so when my colleagues are struggling to, get their head around things, we just go back to that. Remember what you do in work, apply it. And I always find that it helps me remember when I'm thinking about chromosomes.
Yeah, Yeah, definitely. I think we all have to like learn that for boards and everything
Yeah.
of just different things. And yeah, it's really helpful to kind of be able to bring it to something that someone is already familiar with in that sense. So I would love to hear from each of you of how you became involved in LGBTQA plus advocacy within cancer genetic counseling. We all heard a little bit from you in terms of that, but would love to hear more if anybody wants to start us out there.
Yeah, I'm happy to go
Go ahead,
first.
Diane. Yeah.
So for me, it really started when I met with my very first transgender patient. So I met with my first trans patient really shortly after finishing grad school. And I knew from our intake ahead of time that he was trans and he was seeking testing for a familial BRCA mutation. And as I was prepping to meet with him, I was just astounded by the lack of information. So I had had zero training in my graduate program focused on trans health at all, but I still felt like I knew where to find resources, where to look for information for cases I wasn't familiar with, right? But there was just nothing there. I searched through the Journal of Genetic Counseling. I don't believe there was a single article at that point with transgender in the title. There were no guidelines for me to follow. There was like one paragraph in the pedigree guidelines on how to document a trans person on a pedigree, but even that wasn't super clear. And it just really highlighted for me the inequities that they're facing. And when I met with him, I couldn't answer his most basic questions like, well, what would my breast cancer risk be? And I'm like, I don't know because we don't have the data and I don't have a place to go and find it. So meeting with him just really motivated me to get more involved in this space and do whatever I could do to help kind of bridge some of these gaps and educate other healthcare providers.
And it really is sad that this is recent history. So we're all relatively young on this call, I'm going to say it. So the fact that Diane, when you were, first you were a recent grad and then having this experience, like we're not talking about 30 years ago. So I think that is helpful to highlight that this is, recent history that we really have only had research, last few years at that point. Kim or Joe, do either of you want to share a little bit more? Kim, yeah.
Yeah, I guess piggybacking off of that, my experience was similar. I started grad school in 2016. So if we're thinking about recent history, this was 9 years ago. And I only just came out in grad school. It was kind of my first foray openly in the queer community. And I was looking in the literature to see what literature existed about LGBT care. And to that point, there was maybe 2 articles total about LGBT care as a whole. And I really wanted to do my capstone research or my graduate school research on something related to LGBT care. And thinking about cancer genetic counseling, there are some really obvious ways that being gender diverse intersects with cancer genetic counseling and thinking about how surgeries and hormones impact risk assessment. So I really focused on that. And I'd say something I really appreciated about entering this space is also being able to build community through it. You'll find that a lot of people who are involved in LGBT advocacy in genetic counseling are also personally LGBT. So it's been a really wonderful way to build community within genetic counseling when it can be hard to kind of define each other.
Yeah, I remember that at a recent National Society of Genetic Counselor conference, NSGC, there was a meetup that somehow I missed, and I'm very sad about that. So, someone let me know if there is one in Seattle this fall. Joe, anything that you wanted to chime in, just more about your background?
Yeah, it was a similar story. It wasn't even my patient. That's just the first trans patient I remember being discussed in our cancer genetics meeting and seeing a whole room full of professionals, genetic counselors, consultants who've been working for 5 years, 10 years, 30 years, being completely stumped with what to do. The uncertainty and the sort of confusion about where do we go from here? Like I can't find anything. And then thinking about how that translates to your patient and the uncertainty must just provide no confidence in healthcare, and also the amount of time it was taking for clinicians to have everyone researching this and having ad hoc discussions, trying to pull meetings together with specialists. um After that, I started working for a gender identity charity, just thinking that this would be a good thing to do. I was just starting to um, really find my own queer identity, so it felt like a helpful thing to be doing. And then I started seeing the other sides of it that weren't genetic specific. The barriers that that everyone we were supporting were facing to just healthcare in general. And that started me, doing my own work, service evaluations, and applying for funding to work on those projects that I'd mentioned.
Yeah, yeah, certainly. You all had a lot of personal experience paired with just what you had, like personal in terms of your own identities and processing, and then also what you were faced with in careers. I think it'd be helpful to provide a little more context in terms of what does gender affirming care in the context of cancer genetics mean? Because a lot of people that may not be as familiar might say, well, why is that different at all? And I think Diane, you kind of started by saying, you had a trans patient that was looking at, well, what is my risk for breast cancer and how does this work? So would be great to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think one thing we've been learning is that a cancer genetics risk assessment can be an important part of gender affirming care, especially if we're talking about breast cancer risk. So sometimes knowing about a certain gene mutation that can increase breast cancer risk might change certain decisions about top surgery, like what type of surgery to get. Could also change like timing of surgery, could also maybe have an impact on hormone use, hormone dose. So it is something that I think cancer genetics has a place to be incorporated in the gender affirmation process. That being said, I think it's really important that it's not a gatekeeping place. We want first and foremost gender affirming care to be the priority for our trans patients, but I think we're hoping to find a way to maybe incorporate cancer genetics as appropriate for the patients who might be impacted by it.
And how much do we know about the risk in terms of people taking hormones and potentially increasing cancer risk? Is there any or enough research in this to be looking at that, especially going back to this example that you had, Diane, of like someone that a trans man that, was looking, okay, does he have a BRCA mutation? Is that a contraindication of taking hormones if you already have a pathogenic variant in a cancer gene, Kim?
Yeah, I'd say that there is some literature, but it's pretty limited. And I'd say not a reason to prevent someone from taking their hormones because often that is much more important. So for example, for a transgender man, taking testosterone would likely lower the chance for breast cancer risk. So sometimes it would lower the chance for cancer. Whereas for maybe a transgender woman, if she chooses to take estrogen, that could increase her chance for breast cancer as compared to a cisgender man, but it's still likely lower than that of a cisgender woman. So again, hormones may lower some cancer risks or increase some cancer risks, but certainly it should be a patient-to-patient discussion about how that impacts their personal understanding of cancer. And I think we need to really prioritize patient autonomy in deciding things about hormones because often people are gatekeeping hormone use because of concerns about cancer risk. And the data is not there to prevent someone from taking hormones in most cases. And B, hormones are very important for a lot of people in terms of their gender affirming care.
Certainly, I wouldn't want healthcare providers to be like, oh, well, we can't be doing that of, just like anything else, taking all of the data and weighing that out. Joe?
Yeah, exactly what Kim is saying. Agree with that. And Kim mentioned that there is some research out there that we can start to have these discussions about. But what we're really lacking, we need more research overall. But what we're really lacking is research specific to patients with a genetic risk, a predisposition. We haven't. All of that research is really focused on people when we don't know anything about the family history. We don't know if there's any gene variants, and at the moment we're basing our risk assessments on the general population of trans patients rather than that stratified risk taking into account family history or genetics.
And family history is one that, as genetic counselors, that's like our bread and butter, right?
Yeah.
But just like any patient, they may not have family history data or it might be limited. And in this context, it could be from estrangement, lack of support, where those relationships have not continued. And so they may only know up to a certain point with family health history of certain individuals. Joe and Diane, since you see patients still, how do you navigate these cases? And maybe it's more of that psychosocial angle of trying to provide support that, hey, a lot of people don't know their family history.
Yeah, I definitely do normalize lack of family connections because this is not something exclusive to our trans patients. Lots of people aren't in contact with all of their family members for lots of reasons, but it is certainly something I think we see more often with our trans patients, unfortunately. And so, we do the best we can with what they know. We try to get as much family history information as we can, but sometimes they don't know enough to necessarily meet criteria for testing, but they might still very much be interested in testing. So sometimes we do have to explore other avenues, like maybe having them self-pay for the testing rather than going through health insurance. I have also noticed for some of my trans patients who test positive, if they're not in contact with their family members, it can be really challenging for them because they might feel some kind of moral obligation to share their mutation status with their relatives, but they're also not in contact with their relatives for very legitimate reasons. And so it can be a real struggle for them kind of navigating how to approach that. And so all I can do as a GC is kind of be there with them to support them and help them come to what's going to be the best decision for them and their own safety and health.
Yeah, so much to take into account with this. Joe?
I'm coming in from the UK perspective, so our system's probably going to differ in certain ways, and the healthcare systems, the funding is all going to be a little bit different. But from our perspective, um, I think often it's obviously getting what confirmations we can, but understanding that there is going to be aspects that we can't confirm, and sometimes we need to have a little bit of flexibility with our guidelines. The guidelines for genetic testing, it varies sometimes from person to person you speak to, but they're guidelines, they're not rules. And we need to be understanding of situations where anyone can't confirm their family history, and take into account what is going to be in the best interest of the patient. And we also have that sort of second scenario that you described, Diane. When we have a patient who, whether they're trans or cis, they are not able to or not comfortable to contact their relatives, we often defer to a system where, with patients' consent, we can write to our patients' relatives, GPs, their sort of family doctor, to say, an anonymous letter that says, this variant has been found in a relative of yours. Please discuss with your patient and refer them to genetics. All we need is their full name and their date of birth. If the patient's got that information, we can usually track down the doctor to help share that information.
And certainly something I hear that GCs in the US and Canada do as well.
Yeah.
And, even outside of for cisgender patients as well, if you can help with that. So, we wear a lot of hats as genetic counselors. And part of being able to accomplish all of this with a patient, if we take a step back, is building trust with patients, especially when patients in our community may have experienced prior healthcare discrimination to a certain level. Unfortunately, we almost have to assume they've experienced something. Probably all of us on here have experienced something that you're like, yeah, that's not really right, or you said something in a way that didn't make me feel normal. So we've certainly talked about that in previous installments of our Pride webinar installments. So is there different aspects that Diane and Joe you have in mind when you do see that a patient is transgender, gender diverse, and thinking about, okay, what are different ways that I can build trust? And do you ask about those experiences? How do you navigate that,
Yeah,
Diane?
I mean, I don't always ask outright if it comes up naturally and there's something that I can do to make sure I'm avoiding something or something I can do to make my patients more comfortable. It does sometimes come up naturally in the conversation. But I think one thing that we do just as an institute, we have a lot of just visual representations of inclusivity. There's pride flags everywhere. Most of us are wearing rainbow lanyards, and I have a inclusive pride pin, just anything we can do to kind of symbolize a safe space. And one thing I think I more intentionally do with my trans patients is justifying all of my questions more than I do with my cis patients. So we know that trans patients, we've heard from so many of them that like they go into urgent care for a sore throat and they get asked about their genitalia, like things that are totally inappropriate to why they're being seen for care. And so we do ask a lot of invasive medical questions, but every question I'm asking has a reason for being asked. So I try to just more intentionally explain why I'm asking the questions I'm asking to try to help with that trust and make sure that they're aware it's not just curiosity, that this is relevant for their health, and they can also decline to answer anything they don't feel comfortable with.
Yeah, that's so helpful. That's something I do for all patients when I'm asking about consanguinity. I preface it by saying, I ask all of my patients this and different aspects. I offer this testing to all patients. Joe, anything else?
I think we've got to also just remember to be kind to ourselves as well, and know that none of us are fallible. Like, we might make a mistake, and I think part of building confidence is that if you do make that genuine mistake, just making sure that you're apologizing, concisely, briefly, and making sure that you're not making the same mistake again. I think sometimes acknowledging our own limitations sometimes builds trust with patients, and acknowledging where we're lacking in that research, and not pretending to be experts when we've not got a whole wealth of data. um, it helps to show that we're supporting and being honest and truthful.
Yeah, the transparency, I think, goes a long way when you're like, hey, we actually don't have a lot of research on this we've been talking about. And as we are talking about research and publications, it's only been the last few years, as we've mentioned, that there have even been any research or publications, within this intersection of gender affirming care and cancer genetics. Kim, I'm going to say that probably out of the three of you panelists, you've published the most. I'm getting nods from Joe and Diane. I think every time, I would say once a week on LinkedIn when I open it up, oh, Kim has published another paper with other colleagues. So lots and lots. I mean, someone can just go off all weekend reading all of your publications. And one that caught my eye this year was one titled Navigating Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Data Privacy Concerns in the United States, Genetic Practices. What are some takeaways from this paper, and how can we protect patients in our community?
Yeah, so this paper is a commentary that was really inspired by kind of the onslaught of anti-transgender legislation that has been happening for years, but has been reinvigorated in a terrifying way by the Trump administration. And so thinking about, yes, it is best practice in a lot of ways to collect data about sexual orientation and gender identity and to document this. And in a perfect world, this would help people access the care that they need and would help providers understand the care that they need, but also balancing that with the real fears of discrimination for patients. One of the main things that triggered writing this paper was there was a case at Vanderbilt University where they released the patient records of transgender individuals to the Tennessee Attorney General because of a fraud investigation, which really showed some holes in HIPAA protections. And so what the paper does is really describes limitations in our laws and policies around patient data. And it really advocates for, okay, let's take a step back. Yes, collecting sexual orientation and gender identity data is necessary and important, and it's necessary to understand on large scale how like cancer risks are affected by gender affirming medical care, for example, but also to prioritize patient privacy and autonomy in a world that they are actively being discriminated against, whether that be their records being released in like a really terrifying way like that, or even by providers who don't value their rights and lives. In a time where trans autonomy and rights are being threatened, we want to make sure that our patients have some authority over their data. So having transparent conversations, again, to the point of transparency, transparent conversations with our patients about, like, thank you so much for sharing this with me. Let's think about, like, is this something you want documented in your record? And many patients might want it documented for their providers, and many patients may not want it provided. Just because a patient discloses an identity to you doesn't mean that they want all of their providers to know. And so really prioritizing that in our patient encounters and on a more global scale thinking, how can we advocate for protections for patients? How can we advocate for policies that allow data segmentation or explicit consent for these things to be disclosed, like those exist for psych records, for example, we could expand those protections, and just making people more aware of, okay, documentation is not always the best thing and not everyone wants that. Again, I think in these really horrible times, we need to be really cautious, and really giving our patients the autonomy.
Yeah, it is really important. It's such a balance to say, okay, well, let's collect data for research so we can make things better, but then also be protecting patients. Do we want to be having them identified in a system of some kind? It's like, how do we straddle the line with that? And it is a very, very scary time with recent anti-trans legislation. How do we see this impacting more healthcare for trans patients? I guess maybe I'll pick on you, Diane, as also being in the US. And then, Joe, if you have anything to add more from the global perspective after.
Yeah, I mean, I think we know trans patients are losing access to care, especially trans youth are losing access to gender affirming care. And trans adults as well are not getting the same access. And so we also know that they might be less likely to disclose their transgender identity to their healthcare providers, might not want it documented. So I think it poses a lot of challenges. To echo Kim's point, I think recently we've had some discussions at our institution about documentation and how do we protect our trans patients, and do we need to have these more explicit conversations with them about how we're documenting them in our record, if we know they're trans, but it's not necessarily reflected in the charts. I also anticipate, I mean, we've already been seeing this for a while, but sometimes people who don't have access to gender affirming care might be seeking genetic testing as a way to get some gender affirming care. So for instance, people who can't access top surgery through their health insurance company are almost seeking a mutation associated with breast cancer risk, because then they could get their insurance to cover a risk reducing mastectomy, and essentially give them risk reduction and gender affirming care. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see more of that as well as people lose access.
Yeah, that makes sense. And while I'll sidebar on that topic while we're talking about it, is there a difference in terms of if someone has had top surgery and then later find out, let's say they have a BRCA pathogenic variant, is traditional top surgery and like what is usually done, is that removing enough breast tissue where it's equivalent to what we would do for a bilateral prophylactic mastectomy? Kim, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so they are often different surgeries, but different surgeons do it in a different way. So it would be a conversation for someone who's had top surgery to have with their surgeon. Often for a classic top surgery, they do leave tissue because aesthetically with risk reducing bilateral mastectomies, especially if there isn't reconstruction, typically they remove as much tissue as possible. And sometimes there can be a little bit of a concave appearance, whereas top surgery is typically done for gender affirming care and more aesthetic purposes. So often they'll leave some breast tissue. And so if someone had a BRCA mutation, for example, and already had top surgery, it might be important that they think about screening like MRIs, or if possible mammograms or ultrasounds, or considering additional surgery if that's something that's important to them. Again, not all top surgery is done in the same way. So some top surgeons might do it in a way that is removing most of the breast tissue. It's just not necessarily as standardized in that way, and it might depend on the person's body habitus. So again, that's another reason why it's important to help people access cancer genetic testing in case it would change their surgical decisions. Also to say, not everyone who tests positive for a BRCA variant would necessarily want a risk reducing mastectomy, and should still have the option to get a kind of more classic top surgery, or thinking about a mastectomy with reconstruction in a masculinizing way too.
Yeah, Joe?
There's individual differences between different people's top surgeries. Makes it so difficult to get the research about what risk it is that remains in that tissue. It's such an unknown that there is we've struggled so much to develop any guidelines for patients in that scenario. What can you offer? It's going to be individual to each patient, and that really is one of those big areas of uncertainty. And I'm not even certain how we would get that research together, because there's going to be so many different variables. As you know, as Kim was saying, it's so important to involve different specialists and the patient's preference in there. Like a multidisciplinary approach is so important in these cases to prevent those scenarios where patients have ended up with something that actually, if they'd taken more time, had more involvement from specialists, they could have had a completely different outcome that might have suited them better. I know that sometimes we're considering sort of essentially a surgery like a bilateral mastectomy, but then using sort of lipofilling to sculpt a bit more of a sort of contoured chest, but there's still so much uncertainty about outcomes and risks remaining.
And Joe, you've been working on developing the UK's first cancer genetics guidelines for trans patients. Are there other aspects that have gone into this that you would like the audience just to know about, other considerations?
Well, do you know what, that is the one point in our meeting we came up with recommendations, like 33 sets of recommendations to put to a meeting of experts, clinicians in genetics and endocrinology and gender identity, but also sort of patients and member of the public and charities and advocates, put forward these 33 different recommendations, and the one that we couldn't get a consensus on to develop a guideline was about what to do with breast screening in the case of that top surgery, when there is potentially some breast tissue remaining. The things
Impressive
that
you have 33 other though. Like that's
yeah, 32
wow.
others, 32
32. Okay,
others.
it was 33.
And
Got
a
it.
lot of that, a lot of that, I think if you read through the paper, it seems so obvious. There's statements that you'd hope that everyone's doing already, but just to have that as a guideline set in stone, genetic services in the UK will agree that it's not appropriate to gatekeep hormones based on genetic risk. To have that as a written guideline, I think, is really important. You'd hope that that would be done already, but to have it written down is great. It was the first guidelines in the UK that talked about breast screening in other scenarios. So, what do we do with patients who are, trans women? They've got an increased risk of breast cancer based on their family history or a gene variant, and they've taken hormones and developed breast tissue. It was the first time that we've got guidelines down that say we should offer trans women equivalent breast screening as we would to cis women with the same family history or the same gene variant, provided that they've been taking hormones and have got that breast tissue development. And the same for trans men who still have breast tissue and have not had gender affirming top surgery. Even if they're taking testosterone, if there's remaining breast tissue, we should be offering the same level of screening as we would for cis women, just to have that clarity. And a bit more clarity on things like pedigree symbols, because when we circling back to trust in appointments, I think what a horrible thing to be sat there with a genetic counselor who's been drawing out your family tree and gets to someone and it's just like, oh, what symbol am I gonna draw here? To have the clarity on what symbols we use for our trans patients, and to be able to explain to them, why, as Diane said earlier, why am I asking this? Why am I drawing it like this? And why might I be annotating your gender, your sex assigned at birth? It's all within those guidelines that these are important questions to ask and to document, and what's the most appropriate way to do it.
Yeah, and it's been important, I think, of having those pedigree updates. And there has been different iterations over time. And so I think it is important for people to familiarize themselves with that. It is very easy to Google nowadays. And, I'm almost wondering if this is one thing for you, Diane, that came out of the SIG that you co-founded and you're the former co-chair. And this is part of NSGC, so National Society of Genetic Counselors, Cancer Specialty Interest Group, which we call SIGs. And this was the gender inclusive subcommittee that you co-founded. Was this one of the things that came out of it, just in terms of pedigree symbol upgrades, I would say, and making it inclusive and affirming? Are there other aspects that have come out of the SIG or that you're hoping will come out of the SIG over time?
Yeah, so we can't take credit for the pedigree guidelines. I wish we could.
I was hoping I was
We
like
may have
teeing it
helped with a
up, and
little
I was like,
pressure.
yeah.
Yeah, it's the subcommittee has been just a great way for genetic counselors who are engaged in this space to collaborate with each other across multiple institutions. I think we've done a lot of education, webinars, NSGC presentations, kind of highlighting how inadequate the old pedigree guidelines were. So maybe we helped put a little pressure for the new ones, but we weren't directly involved with the updated guidelines. We have been involved in some position statements through NSGC, and there is now a practice guideline on gender inclusive counseling that's in development that was proposed by the subcommittee. So we were happy to see that go through. We were also able to get NSGC to kind of add a designation for genetic counselors as a gender inclusive provider. So now, as patients, they can essentially, if they're using the Find a Genetic Counselor tool, they can filter for genetic counselors who have identified as gender inclusive providers to help providers who might be a more safe space for them to be seen. So we were excited to see that. We've also had one very exciting project that came out of the subcommittee. It's called TGD Can Screen. So this is a tool that was largely started by Bailey Hulswet and Denise Ma within our subcommittee. And it's a clinical evaluation tool for trans patients to kind of input information about personal history, family history, genetic testing results. And it gives them what information we have about what we estimate some of their cancer risks might be, so they can take that with them to a healthcare provider who might not be as educated on these issues. So I think that's the most recent exciting project that's come out of the subcommittee.
Yeah, that's impressive and just great that this exists. And thank you for co-founding it. That is just adding so much to genetic counselors to have resources. Like, the three of you have all shared aspects that are like, okay, you're developing so much for the genetic counseling community and obviously the cancer genetic counseling community, really worldwide. Just thank you. I'm sure I'll say it again at the end, but while I'm thinking of it. And so normally I wait a little longer to take audience questions, but we have so many that I don't think we'll even get through at this point. So I'm going to jump over to that. Feel free, people, to throw in more questions. We'll see what we get to here. And I don't know if just I have the power because I see it as a host, but feel free to thumbs up certain questions if you want them to go towards the top, so I see them first. But while we're talking about resources, and I'm not going to say anyone's name, I'm just going to have anonymous for all of the questions submitted for anyone that's worried about submitting a question. So one of the questions that ties into what we're talking about right now is, what are some good resources that GCs can use when prepping to see transgender, gender diverse individuals and discuss their care? We've shared so many. Is there any others that we haven't shared yet? I know Joel and Michael, who are behind the scenes PhenoTips, are sharing a lot in the chat that we've mentioned. They're finding links. You all are sending links. Anything else that you wanted to mention?
So this wouldn't be specifically for prepping a certain case, but I do want to give a plug to the Amplify modules. So these were initially developed by Nicole Huser and then later adapted by Gabrielle Ernst, and they're kind of maintained within the subcommittee. And basically, it's an online educational module that you can go through. It takes a few hours to get through everything, but it's designed for genetic counselors in the cancer and prenatal spaces to kind of give them the background knowledge on gender affirming care. And this is maintained every year about, it's updated, and we get input from members of the trans and non-binary patient communities. There's little like snippets and clips of transgender individuals throughout to kind of give some more personal experiences, and it is kept relatively up to date. So I think that's a great resource for anybody who wants to increase their education in this space.
Yeah, I'll say that I was actually part of Gabby's project with that. I think it was her thesis project at the time, I want to say. Okay, good. And so that's actually how I met Holden, who was on our panel maybe 2, 3 years ago for our Pride installment here on PhenoTips Speaker Series. And it was fabulous. I learned so much. Holden taught me a lot specifically because I was paired with him for a role play. And so got a lot of great feedback from him. But wonderful, wonderful resource. Joe, anything else?
I think just some more generic resources as well, like just knowing what local charities there are that might support trans people in the community, so peer-to-peer support or helplines. Just bearing in mind that there may be different, you know, there trans status might have affected their support networks, if that's caused family rifts or isolation. Obviously not specific to trans patients, but we know that there are higher rates of those things. And yeah, looking for your own inclusive resources, like if it comes to breast cancer risks, trying to find your appropriate inclusive resources. We often point patients to a charity called Copperfield in the UK, which is like an online breast awareness tool, sort of guides you through checking your own chest or breast, but it allows you to choose which language is used, so that patients can have that tool available to guide them through that process in a way that makes them feel comfortable, supporting in those minor ways as well.
Yeah, that's amazing, especially using language that they feel comfortable with. So I think that's something that's really important that I don't think we overtly mentioned so far, but taking a cue from patients of what terms they use for certain parts of their body and echoing that language, I find has been helpful. And that's something that Holden actually mentioned to me and years ago that I'm like, oh, that's a really great tip. Another question we have is how do we clarify in a comfortable manner sex-based risks when a patient hasn't disclosed that they are trans? So let's say the referral says female, legal sex is female, but patient is a trans woman.
I
Kim?
think in cancer, this is actually not, or, we could just refer to organs for a lot of cancer risks. Like, for example, talking about instead of female and male risks, it's way more specific to just be like, for prostate cancer risk, for ovarian cancer risk, for breast cancer risk for folks assigned female at birth. I think breast cancer is one that there is distinctions like based on, sex characteristics. But just, being more specific with the organs. And if people have questions about that, due to whatever reason, you can always clarify. But making sure that for everyone, we're saying organ-based risk and doing organ inventories, perhaps instead of just making assumptions based on sex assigned at birth. Because certainly for trans folks, for intersex folks, for cis folks, people may or may not have certain organs that wouldn't be apparent just from a sex assigned at birth.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think something that I've seen, especially just online and social media, is it can be difficult depending on a patient's education level of some people that are assigned female at birth may not realize like they have ovaries, or someone assigned male at birth may not realize they have a prostate. I would say most people know that, but there are some that don't, that it can be confusing. Do you all have thoughts on kind of straddling that line of being inclusive in terms of people's education levels and what they understand, while also being inclusive with terminology? Because I agree, I don't like saying female cancers because I think, first of all, it's not accurate. If I'm referring to breast, ovarian, uterine, different cancers there. But how do we, especially in that more lay people of how do we do that? Like I struggle with that. I want to be able to use those terms, but then I'm like, am I missing people that don't understand that? Kim, do you have other thoughts with that? Advice for me?
Well, I was just going to say this is so not unique to like trans issues. Genetic counselors are always educating patients about complex topics in genetics. And so I do like to point out to people that like talking about gender and sex is not uniquely difficult. And in fact, I think it's a wonderful opportunity to help educate folks, about what organ systems they may or may not have. If that, so if we just said, for example, in that situation, female cancers, someone might not realize that they have ovaries and need to think about ovarian cancer. So I think it opens a door to be like, we're going to talk about different organs. And I want you to ask me, and opening the door for patients to ask questions when they don't understand something. So saying that on the front end, please let me know if something doesn't make sense, or stop me if you want me to clarify what this means, so we can have more open dialogue with patients. I think it really opens the door to have more open and honest conversations too.
What do you think, Joe?
I think just got to remember as well that we're always, even without realizing it, adapting our communication with our patients. We pitch all of our appointments, our communication with patients slightly differently depending on what we're gauging as their understanding. And I think a lot of the time don't even recognize that we're doing it. And this is very much the same thing. It doesn't have to be that you always say the same phrases. I think you'd be surprised that, you can pick up when you might say something, you use some terminology, use sort of specific language, and your patient's not quite getting it, and you can adapt slightly or explain, and yeah, just remember to adapt to your patient, be patient-centered. Great to use more inclusive and neutral language, but just, yeah, acknowledge that there'll be times when you might have to shift that slightly.
Yeah, which is what we all do, right? You're explaining a VUS and you're like, all right, I got to take a couple steps back and explain what a variant is or something. And Joe, there's a question specifically for you. I was wondering, as there is a lack of consensus on breast screening following top surgery, what do you advise your patients at an increased risk of breast cancer? I think you kind of talked about this a little bit, but anything else you wanted to throw in there?
It's specifically in that scenario where someone's had top surgery but might have some tissue remaining.
That's how I'm understanding it. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the best thing to do in those scenarios is take an individual approach, and it sounds like passing the buck, but we need to refer to specialists who work in screening and the surgeons who have done the surgery to talk about, the volume that's left. And we can only give a a rough estimate that, your risk will have been decreased compared to a cis woman. But you may still be at a higher risk of breast cancer than a cis man. And we just have to be adaptive in thinking what tissue is there, what is possible with this volume of tissue. Is mammography going to be possible? Is MRI available? Is ultrasound potentially going to be effective? You have to just acknowledge that we don't have the exact data, and we can say that your risk might fall somewhere between these two categories, and highlight the importance of chest awareness in that scenario, as well as getting them seen by a specialist who can weigh in a bit more.
Yeah, and seeing which of those three different types of screening is appropriate. And yeah, doing a lot of like that's more like the personalized medicine aspect that we're all
Yeah.
familiar with anyway. There's another great question. We talked at length about those who are gender diverse, but how do you or do you change your counseling methodologies for those who are intersex? I don't think we've really talked about that topic too much yet. Anyone have thoughts on just approaching that in terms of intersex folks? I
I mean, I
finally
think
stumped them. Go ahead, Kim.
Well, I think for intersex folks, it would really depend on what intersex variation we're talking about. Often intersex traits have some genetic underpinning. So understanding what is that? Are we talking about Klinefelter or Turner or like androgen insensitivity? And again, doing our due diligence to make sure that we're looking up those things before seeing the patient. A lot of care is also intersex exclusive and only talks about sex assigned at birth, but that's really not accounting for a lot of intersex folks who maybe their intersex variations are not apparent at birth, or aren't documented, or are only found at puberty or at menopause or incidentally through genetic testing. So again, I think it depends on what the variation is and thinking about what cancer risk that variation might intersect with. In the cancer department, one thing I will say is often cancer risks associated with intersex variations are weaponized against the intersex community and are used to rationalize why we're doing gonadectomies for intersex people that are maybe unnecessary. So like basically scaring people with cancer risks, and then parents are choosing to have their infants' gonads removed when maybe that cancer risk wasn't as high as, was kind of described, or that surgery could be deferred until that person could have autonomy in making that decision, or, surgery was posed as the only option where there could be screening methods. So again, from that angle, I do think we need to be thoughtful too about how we pose cancer risks for parents who have intersex infants, and making sure that, because infant surgeries are really harmful for intersex folks who don't need them. I'm not talking about surgeries that help people urinate, but I'm talking about unnecessary surgeries that are often done to relieve parental distress.
Yeah, that certainly is a very, very tough conversation to have. But as you're saying, like a lot of times healthcare providers are not fully educated on this, and therefore they're not educating parents properly for them to make a truly informed decision about irreversible surgeries there. And someone has a question that ties into this. Do you think that there should be more coverage of disorders of sex development? And they're saying, examples like intersex conditions, adrenal insensitivity, into intro genetics classes, because when I was a student, it was not discussed at all until higher level courses like embryology. A lot of confusion and discrimination might stem from just not knowing about these things. Or do you think this would fall in a completely different category? Maybe I'm incorrectly correlating this in gender affirming care. Kim?
Yeah, I work at in education in a genetic counseling program. And one thing I will say is I think all of our programs need to do a better job at incorporating intersex justice and trans justice into all aspects of care, not just like a special side conversation of this is LGBT considerations, which yes, that's important. And often there is a need for a separate conversation like we're having right now. But also to think about, okay, if we're talking about breast cancer risk, how does something like top surgery affect that risk? Or how does being intersex affect cancer risk? So yes, I do think we need to have more lectures on kind of different variations of sex characteristics. I'm not sure how well they're integrated into programs, but also thinking about how we can not just have DEI or diversity topics as special lectures, but incorporating them into everything we talk about to really encompass the full breadth of patients that we may see, not just like cisgender, white, non-disabled Americans, for example.
Yeah, yeah, certainly. I think it becomes challenging in that way. Yeah. And I have someone that's sharing that they did their master's capstone project on best practices for recording and reporting sex and gender demographic information on genetic testing requisitions and reports. So I'm surprised we actually haven't talked about this yet. There's so much to talk about, we only have an hour. The question comment goes on to say, a main concern participants have was being stuck between a hard and a rock place with the potential to be outed to family members by report sharing and the many downstream negative consequences there. Well, recognizing that by not sharing the report, they may be doing harm in not sharing critical health information with family members who may be eligible for testing screening. Are these concerns your patients have also brought forward? And how do you address this? Do you have any suggestions for how GCs can balance the privacy and safety of our patients with our duty to inform at-risk family members? So just to kind of sum up what I just read here, basically, if people are reporting that someone is transgender, gender diverse, and then having that on a report, and somehow that report gets shared with a family member because we want to let them know they should be tested, but now they're finding out that someone is trans or gender diverse. Dan, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think this goes back to a lot of what Kim was discussing earlier about just taking it on a case by case basis and having these intentional conversations with each patient about how they want to be documented. I have also noticed on the lab test reporting, so I'll usually tell patients ahead of time, this is how you'd be represented on the report. Many of them now list sex assigned at birth and gender. Do you feel comfortable with that being on the report? But I've also found that the genetic testing labs seem to be, on the large, very willing to update those reports later on. So I have had cases just like this where a patient didn't feel comfortable sharing their report as it was, that which could identify them as a trans person. And I just asked the lab for an amended report that changed the gender marker so that they had a version of the report to share with their relatives in a way that made them feel comfortable. So there are, I think the labs are willing to work with you to make this more affirming and safe for these patients.
Kim?
I would also say on a larger scale, CLIA and CAP certifications are what labs have to follow in terms of like their reporting standards. And yes, they do have to ask some on the front end about sex for often like insurance documentation, but labs are not required by either CLIA or CAP to report it on the laboratory reports. So if you're a genetic counselor or genetics provider working in a lab, maybe talking to the lab about is having a sex or gender marker on the report that patients get even necessary. They need some identifiers, but that can just be their medical record number, their date of birth, and their name. And so really we can nip this in the butt on, or nip this in the, whatever the term is, we can
I think you
really
got
fix
it.
this
Yeah.
on a different end, by thinking about, is it even necessary to start on a report?
Yeah. Wow. Well, I cannot believe we're already at the top of the hour again. I have so many more. I wish this was like a 3-hour session. You guys have a lot more to do, but I'm like selfishly, I want to keep talking to all three of you. I'm sure everybody's feeling the same. There's some questions we didn't get to, but I'll say we got to most of them from the audience. So thank you, the three of you, for sharing so much insight and all of the hard and sometimes thankless work that you've been doing on behalf of our community. I just really heartfelt thank you. As I said at the beginning, our Pride webinar here every year is my favorite usually. So, and I'd say, yes, this was my favorite this year. So thank you so much. And for everybody tuning in live, you're going to see a feedback link in your browser when this webinar ends. And we're also going to email it to you within the next day. Please, please, please take a minute to offer feedback to help us improve our upcoming series installments, because then we're going to cover what you really want us to hear. So this email is also going to include a link to the PhenoTips Speaker Series page where you can sign up to receive alerts on upcoming sessions so you don't miss the next live webinar. Or if you just want to go right now before you get the email, go to phenotips.com, hit the resources tab, and the speaker series is going to pop up on that drop-down menu. And I'll say 300. Nope, that's the other show. 32 installments that have already been released are on there. And we're going to take the rest of the summer to think about everything we've learned in this webinar. And we're going to be back in September after our lovely summer break. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Make sure if you want to catch any of those installments in your podcast app, search PhenoTips Speaker Series. And again, Diane, Joe, and Kim, thank you so, so much. This was amazing. I really hope that, this was a very highly attended webinar, and I can't even think of how many people are going to listen to this after. So thank you so much to the three of you, and happy Pride, everybody. Very exciting. Thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the summer until September. Bye, everybody.